This photograph was taken sometime in the winter of 1944 on a remote ranch outside Camp Hearn, Texas. No one knows the name of the photographer. Some say it was an American guard. Others claim it was a Red Cross inspector who stopped breathing the moment he saw the scene unfolding. What we do know is this. The woman in the frame is a German POW, barely 22, frozen in terror as she extends a trembling hand toward an American farm dog. Her eyes say she expects teeth, violence, the brutality she was taught to fear. But look closer. The dog isn't attacking. It's leaning forward, calm, gentle, almost as if inviting her touch. So the question becomes unsettling. Why is a German prisoner reaching for an American dog in the middle of a war? And what happened in the seconds after the shutter clicked? October 12, 1944. A ranch outside Camp Hearn, Texas. The photograph, grainy, sun-bleached, and taken from an angle that suggests the photographer's hands were shaking, captures the exact moment Lieselotte Brandt stopped breathing. In the image, she stands stiffly beside a wooden fence, the dry Texas wind pulling strands of hair across her face. Her eyes are locked on the blur of movement charging toward her. A large farm dog, mid-stride, ears pinned back, muscles rippling beneath its coat. Someone looking at the photo today might assume she was simply startled. But anyone who knew where she came from and what she had been taught would understand why terror radiated from her posture. Lisa had been raised on a steady diet of Reich propaganda. American dogs are trained to tear prisoners apart. They release them on German women. Their farmers own beasts that can smell fear. These stories had been repeated in training barracks, whispered in bomb shelters, printed in pamphlets slipped under doors. So, when the dog broke into a sprint, dust flying behind it, her instincts screamed the same message. This is how it ends. She did not run. She couldn't. Her boots rooted into the Texas dirt as if the land itself had grabbed her ankles. Her breath collapsed into her chest. She felt the old, familiar numbness of surrender sweep through her fingers. She braced herself for teeth, for pain, for the final confirmation that everything she had believed about America was true. But before the dog reached her, a man's voice cut through the moment. "Easy, Rusty." The dog didn't slow. If anything, it accelerated, straight toward her. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. The impact never came. Something warm brushed her fingers. A wet nose pressed against her palm. When she opened her eyes, the dog, massive, golden, tail sweeping the dust, was licking her like she was an old friend returning home. Its tail thumped against her leg with rhythmic insistence, begging for affection. She jerked her hand away, but the dog simply nudged her arm, insistent, joyful. Behind her, the farmer chuckled. "He likes you." The absurdity of the words struck her harder than any blow. "He likes you." As if this were normal, as if a German prisoner, enemy of his son, his country, his daily news, was simply another visitor on his land. The farmer, Henry Collins, leaned on the fence post like a man who had seen the world's troubles and decided they were not worth rushing over. He wore a sweat-stained hat and clothes patched at the elbows, the uniform of a man whose hands knew work. His family had lived on this land since before the First World War. His father had broken ground with a mule. Henry, raised in the Great Depression, had learned early that neighbors were neighbors, no matter where they came from. Now he was looking at a German prisoner of war as if she were a niece visiting from out of town. "You can pet him," he added in a gentler tone. "Rusty doesn't bite." Lisa's hand shook as she extended it. Rusty nudged it again, then leaned his entire weight against her thigh in a gesture of pure trust. She had seen dogs in wartime, emaciated, snarling creatures trained for brutality. Rusty was different. He smelled of sun-warmed grass and barn dust. His eyes held no malice, only expectation. Something inside her wavered. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Nothing in Texas was supposed to look like this. When she had been captured in France and transported across the Atlantic, she imagined America as a land of factories and punishment. Instead, the train to Camp Hearn had rolled past fields so wide they felt like oceans, silos that rose like monuments, barns overflowing with grain, and cattle herds larger than any she had imagined. In Germany, the war had stripped everything. In America, abundance seemed to spill from every window, every farm gate, every glass held casually in an American hand. It made no sense. In 1944, the United States was producing airplanes faster than Germany could shoot them down. 96,000 in that year alone. Liberty ships left shipyards every 3 days, sliding into the water before welders even cooled their tools. 12 million Americans wore uniforms, and yet the fields remained full. The store shelves stayed stocked. The mess halls overflowed with meat and bread and coffee that tasted strong enough to raise the dead. Germany rationed everything. America rationed nothing important. Lisa had grown up standing in lines. Bread lines, potato lines, coal lines. Now, as a prisoner, she found herself on a ranch where food was plentiful, dogs were friendly, and the man entrusted with her custody spoke to her not as an enemy, but as a young woman who looked like she needed rest. Henry studied her expression with a hint of concern. "You all right, miss?" She nodded automatically, though she felt anything but all right. Her mind raced to reconcile the contradiction. The world's richest nation treating its enemies with a kindness she had rarely seen extended to German civilians, much less prisoners. America, she realized, was not fighting. The same war Germany was. Here, surrounded by harvest-ready fields and a dog demanding affection, she felt as if she had stepped through a crack in reality, into a world where strength didn't require cruelty, and victory didn't demand hatred. Rusty barked once, upbeat and impatient for her attention. She flinched, though slightly less than before. Henry smiled. "See? He's just saying hello." But Lise could not answer. She was staring not at the dog but at the man, and behind him, at the land, the barns, the endless sky. The question lodged itself in her chest like a splinter she could not pull free. Why was she, an enemy raised to fear this nation, being welcomed as if she belonged here? And even more unsettling, what did it mean if everything she had ever believed about America was wrong? Fear, real fear, doesn't announce itself with shouting or violence. It slips under the skin slowly, through years of stories, symbols, and warnings told by people you trusted. For Lisa, fear had started long before she ever stepped foot in Texas. She could still remember the posters tacked to the walls of her Luftwaffe auxiliary barracks. The images were drawn in lurid colors. American soldiers towering like giants, their faces twisted into animalistic snarls. One showed a farm dog with jaws soaked in blood, dragging a German woman across a patch of dirt. Another displayed a Texas farmer firing a shotgun at a running figure in prisoner stripes. Beneath each image were captions stamped in heavy black Gothic letters, "Americans release dogs on female prisoners." Escapists are shot without warning. No mercy for German women. Nightly radio broadcasts echoed the same message. Joseph Goebbels' voice, a practiced blend of drama and venom, flooded the airwaves with stories of American cruelty. Albert Speer's speeches framed the United States as a machine without a soul, a place where prisoners were starved so their labor could be squeezed dry. If a rumor appeared in the barracks, no matter how absurd, It grew into truth with the ease of wildfire. American dogs rip prisoners apart. Farmers use prisoners as target practice. No German woman leaves an American camp unbroken. The power of propaganda was not that it was believed instantly. It was that it was repeated endlessly until the repetition itself became a kind of logic. So, when Lisa was captured in Normandy in the summer of 1944, she spent the first hours after surrender waiting for the brutality she had been taught to expect. When it didn't come immediately, she assumed it would come later, after the interrogations, after the ship, after America. The truth revealed itself slowly, and in its own way, that was even more terrifying. The journey across the Atlantic began under a low sky, with steel-gray water slapping the sides of the Liberty ship. Hundreds of prisoners were packed below deck, the air thick with sweat and diesel fumes. At first, Lisa braced for starvation rations. Instead, an American guard passed out bread and hot soup every morning and evening. She waited for the cruelty that had been promised. It never appeared. But the deeper fear came not from the absence of abuse, but from the first glimpse she caught of America through the ship's railing when they docked in Norfolk. She had never seen anything like it. The port stretched for miles, cranes rising like iron skeletons against the sky. Mountains of coal, actual mountains, towered above warehouses the size of her entire district back home. Trains lined up in parallel tracks delivered endless freight cars of equipment and food. She watched dock workers load cargo so quickly and efficiently that it seemed choreographed. No one shouted. No one panicked. Everything moved with the smooth rhythm of a country that was not merely functioning, but thriving. Smoke poured from shipyards in every direction, the air vibrating with the clang of construction. A guard casually explained that these yards produced Liberty ships so fast that a new one hit the water every 3 days. Every 3 days. Germany could barely keep its rail lines open under Allied bombing. Lisa pressed her hands against the railing. This wasn't the struggling, decadent America that Goebbels had described. This was something far more frightening. A nation that could outproduce, outfeed, and outlast anything the Reich could manufacture or imagine. She realized, perhaps for the first time, why Germany's future had begun to shrink long before the front lines did. As the prisoners boarded the trains that would carry them to Texas, her fear deepened. The train rolled past city blocks lit up even in daylight, streets buzzing with activity, storefronts overflowing with goods she hadn't seen in years. In Germany, the war had taken everything. Here, there was no sign of shortage. Even the advertisements posted in station windows shocked her. Chocolate bars, refrigerators, fresh bread, gasoline. It was as if America lived in another universe entirely. When the trains left the cities and crossed into the rural South, the landscape only amplified her dread. Fields of cotton and corn fanned out in every direction. Storage silos loomed like monuments. Barns were painted clean and full. The sheer scale of abundance made something knot in her chest. A whisper spread through the POW car. We never had a chance. Even the guards, young men barely older than her, did not seem exhausted or beaten down the way German soldiers looked by 1944. These Americans were sun-browned, broad-shouldered, fed on diets that seemed impossible under wartime conditions. Their uniforms were new. Their boots were clean. Their faces carried none of the hollowness of men stretched thin by years of attrition. Lisa realized with a sharp pang that everything she was seeing contradicted the world she had been raised to believe, which, in a strange way, made her even more afraid. The first step through the gates of Camp Hearn only intensified that fear. She braced for the brutality she had been taught to expect. Barking orders, snarling dogs, rifle butts. Instead, the American guards stood calmly, clipboards in hand, checking names with professional boredom. No one shouted. No one shoved. They treated the prisoners as if they were simply people moving through a process. A sergeant handed her a metal tray and pointed toward the mess hall. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her without impatience or suspicion. Inside, rows of long wooden tables waited. Not cages, not chains. The smell of food drifted through the air, rich and warm. She saw eggs, bread, potatoes. Actual butter. She froze again, but not because of fear this time, because her brain struggled to understand how prisoners could be fed like this when civilians back home were boiling weeds to survive. The kindness felt dangerous, destabilizing, like a trap she couldn't see. Because if the Americans were this humane, if they treated their enemies this way, then what else had Germany lied about? But she clung to one last fear, one belief she was sure must be true. The dogs. The first night in camp, as she sat on the bunk in the women's barracks, she heard it, a loud bark somewhere in the dark. A deep, confident sound. Her entire body tensed, muscles coiling. The barrack door slammed open as an American guard walked his patrol route. Rusty's silhouette flashed by the lantern light outside. She pressed herself into the corner of her bunk, waiting for the inevitable command. Release the dogs. Instead, the guard paused at the doorway and nodded politely. "Evening, ma'am. Don't worry. It's just a farm dog." He kept walking. She remained frozen long after he left. The fear didn't come from the dog anymore. It came from the fact that the dog wasn't doing what she had spent years believing it would do. Her mind had been taught to expect brutality. Her eyes were seeing the opposite. And that contradiction felt more terrifying than any threat. Because cruelty was easy to resist. But kindness demanded that she question every truth she had ever been given. And for someone raised in the collapsing Reich, there was nothing more frightening than realizing the enemy might be good. The assignment to Henry Collins' ranch came on a Tuesday morning, announced by a lieutenant with a clipboard and a monotone voice. A group of 12 women, including Lise, were selected to assist local farmers suffering from severe labor shortages. Most of the young men in Robertson County were fighting in France or the Pacific, leaving fields unplowed and herds unmanaged. The war had stretched all of Europe thin, but in America there was still land to tend, cattle to feed, and crops to turn before winter. Henry Collins arrived at Camp Hearn driving a battered pickup that looked older than he was. The truck rattled to a stop, coughing dust into the crisp October air. When he stepped out, he looked nothing like the monstrous Texans described in propaganda. No oversized rifle, no snarling dog by his side, no boots caked with blood. Instead, he wore faded denim overalls and a sun-bleached hat, and he moved with the unhurried ease of a man who trusted both himself and the land beneath his feet. "Morning, ladies," he said, tipping his hat in greeting. The gesture startled the women as much as his gentle tone. A German prisoner was not accustomed to being greeted, certainly not with courtesy. Lisa watched him from behind the others, trying to remain invisible. But Henry's eyes swept the group with the same appraisal he gave to cattle. Practical, not unkind. "You'll be helping me get through harvest," he said. "We'll work hard, but we'll eat good, and you'll sleep better after a day on the land. I promise you that." The words did something to Lise that she couldn't explain. She wasn't used to promises from Americans. She wasn't used to gentleness at all. The ride to the ranch was silent except for the hum of tires on dirt road. When the truck crested a hill, the farm appeared below like a painted scene. Golden fields waving in the wind, A big red barn with white trim, cattle grazing beyond the fence line. A farmhouse stood near a cottonwood tree, its porch cluttered with boots, lanterns, and a rocking chair worn smooth by years of use. It was nothing like Germany, and for Lise, that alone made it frightening. The first kindness came in the shape of a warm cookie. When the women climbed down from the truck, Henry's wife, Margaret Collins, stepped onto the porch holding a tin tray covered with a cloth. The smell that drifted out, sweet, buttery, rich, hit the POWs like a wave. For a moment, none of them moved. In Germany, sugar had been nearly impossible to get for years. Butter was a memory. Fresh-baked anything was a luxury reserved for weddings, black markets, and miracles. Margaret lifted the cloth and said simply, "You must be hungry." The women exchanged stunned looks. Hunger was part of their lives, but being fed by the enemy? That was beyond comprehension. Henry nudged the tray toward them. "Go on, they're warm." Lisa hesitated, then reached out carefully as if the cookie might vanish or turn to smoke. When she bit into it, the world stopped. It was soft, sweet, real, a taste from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She swallowed hard and blinked rapidly, ashamed of the tears burning in her eyes. Henry noticed, but said nothing. He simply nodded, as though feeding strangers was the most natural thing in the world. Then came the second kindness, something even smaller, yet more astonishing. Ice. Margaret set out a pitcher of water filled with clinking cubes. When Henry poured it into tin cups, the prisoners stared in disbelief. In Germany, they drank water lukewarm, when they could find it. Ice was an American luxury that belonged in magazine pages, not in the hands of war prisoners. Lisa touched the cup, startled by the cold against her skin. When she took a sip, she gasped lightly at the shock of it. Cold water felt like a privilege too large for her to claim. Henry only laughed gently. "Texas heat'll melt you if you don't cool off. Drink up." Later, when they began their work outside, Henry walked the women around the ranch to explain their duties. Some would help gather eggs, others would tend vegetable patches, mend fences, or stack hay. The air smelled of alfalfa and dust and sunshine, scents that seemed peaceful, even sacred, compared to the acrid smoke of German bombed-out cities. But there was one thing Henry hadn't warned them about. Rusty. The dog barreled around the corner of the barn like a streak of gold lightning, barking once in greeting before sprinting directly toward the women. Lisa stumbled back with a cry, her heart hammering. The other prisoners jumped as well, but none recoiled the way she did. Rusty skidded to a stop in front of her, tail wagging so hard his whole body wiggled. Lisa braced for pain. Rusty responded with joy. He pushed his nose against her leg, sniffing eagerly. When she didn't move, he nudged her hand insistently. The dog's tail brushed dust into her shoes. Henry chuckled from the porch. "Ma'am, this dog wouldn't harm a fly." His tone was amused but not mocking, kind but not patronizing. And Rusty, oblivious to her terror, gazed up at her with wide, expectant eyes. It took her several seconds to breathe. Another 30 before she finally lowered a hand. Rusty rewarded her with a sloppy lick and a joyful bark that seemed to split the morning open like sunlight. The other women smiled shyly. Lise felt heat rise in her cheeks. Embarrassment, relief, and something else she couldn't name. Perhaps safety. Work on the farm was unlike anything she had known. There were no shouted orders, no punishments for mistakes. Henry showed them how to hold a shovel properly, how to check eggs without cracking them, how to lift hay bales with their knees, not their backs. He taught patiently with humor as though he were training a group of young apprentices, not enemy personnel. Rusty followed Lise everywhere. If she knelt to plant vegetables, he lay down beside her. If she carried a bucket, he trotted next to her, occasionally bumping her calf with his head as though reminding her he was there. His presence unnerved her at first, then slowly steadied her, and the moment he rolled onto his back at her feet, inviting a belly rub, something inside her thawed for the first time since the war began. She laughed, a small, startled sound, quickly smothered, but undeniably real. The other POWs looked up. Henry looked up too. He didn't say anything, but the softening in his expression said more than words. Lunch was served under the shade of the cottonwood tree, eaten, on rough wooden benches that looked carved by time. Margaret brought out plates stacked with slices of roast beef, potatoes, beans, cornbread, and gravy. The sight alone made several prisoners freeze in disbelief. In Germany, by late 1944, citizens were boiling weeds and scraping mold off bread. Soldiers ate watery soups. Meat was a rumor more than a meal. But here, on American soil, as prisoners, they were served beef. Lisa stared at her plate for a long moment. The smell lifted memories from places she hadn't touched in years. Sunday dinners, laughter, her mother humming as she cooked. She blinked until the vision cleared and the present returned. A prisoner sitting at a stranger's table, eating food she had been told Americans would never offer. She ate slowly, reverently. Rusty sat at her feet, thumping his tail against the dirt each time she glanced down. Henry caught the interaction and grinned. "Looks like you've made a friend." She swallowed the bite of beef, unsure how to respond. "No," she said finally in halting English, "he made friend with me." Henry nodded thoughtfully. That's how good dogs work. As the day ended, the sun fell low over the fields, coloring the landscape in deep amber. The prisoners gathered tools, wiped sweat from their brows, and prepared to climb back into the truck for the return to camp. Before they left, Henry called out, "Hold on now." He approached Lise directly, a small, respectful distance kept between them. Rusty sat beside him like a proud sentinel. "Enemy or not," Henry said, adjusting his hat, "you're on my land now. And on this land, folks get treated right." The words landed gently, yet with weight she could feel in her bones. He didn't say it to impress her. He didn't say it as a political statement. He said it because he believed it, because it was the code of his family, of his community, of a generation shaped by hardship but guided by decency. Lisa held his gaze. For the first time, she didn't see a captor. She saw a man who chose kindness where cruelty would have been easier. The truck engine rumbled to life. The women climbed aboard. Rusty barked once as if saying goodbye. Lisa reached out without thinking and brushed her fingers over the top of his head. A simple gesture. A small moment. But it was the first time she had touched anything in America without fear. As the truck rolled away, she looked back at the Collins Ranch, the barn glowing in the sunset, the farmhouse porch light flickering on, the farmer lifting a hand in farewell, and she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not peace, not hope, something more bewildering. The beginning of trust, and that terrified her most of all. The next weeks unfolded with a kind of gentle disorientation, one small kindness after another, each contradicting everything Lisa had been taught. The Collins Ranch became a world suspended between war and peace, a place where the enemy was allowed to breathe, eat, work, and, dangerously, think. Her first evening dinner there felt almost like a dream. Margaret Collins set the table on the porch, the wooden boards warm beneath Lisa's boots. The sky was pink with the fading sun, cicadas humming like distant machinery. She and the other women sat quietly, unsure whether they were even allowed to speak. The smell drifting from Margaret's kitchen, grilled beef, mashed potatoes rich with butter, fresh green beans, and something sweet baking in the oven, made their stomachs twist with a mixture of hunger and disbelief. When Margaret stepped outside carrying a platter of thick steaks glistening with juices, the POWs stared as though she had brought out a piece of the moon. "For you girls," Margaret said with a firm nod, as if feeding prisoners a dinner fit for a holiday were the most reasonable thing in the world. Lisa's throat tightened. She had grown up on meat only during holidays, before rationing stripped Germany bare. During her service, she'd eaten watery soups, stale bread, and thin slices of cabbage. But here, as a POW, she cut into a steak so tender it nearly fell apart beneath her knife. Rusty lay across her feet, head resting on her boot, sighing contentedly each time she dropped him a scrap. She knew she shouldn't share her food, not as a prisoner, not as someone who had known hunger, but she couldn't help it. Henry noticed and cracked a smile. "Careful, you feed him too much, he'll follow you home." Lisa blushed. She had no home to return to. After dinner, Margaret brought out an apple pie fresh from the oven, steam curling into the night air. One of the German women whispered, "This is how prisoners eat?" Her tone carried both awe and confusion. Henry heard her. "This is how guests eat," he said simply. After the dishes were cleared, Lisa followed Margaret inside to help clean up. That was when she saw it. The refrigerator. A white, humming cabinet, cool air escaping as Margaret opened the door. Inside were rows of milk bottles, eggs, vegetables, leftovers, and a bowl covered with cloth containing what looked like more pie filling. Lisa's breath caught. She touched the refrigerator door cautiously, as if it might bite. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You don't have these back home." Lisa shook her head. She had seen one once in a wealthy Berlin home, but never filled like this. Never stocked as if the hunger were an abstract idea. "You're welcome to use anything in here," Margaret said gently. "No one should go hungry." Lisa swallowed hard. No one in Germany has this much. The admission felt like peeling back her own skin. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't pity. She simply rested a hand on the counter and said, "We do what we can. Hard times taught us that." Later that evening, as they scrubbed dishes, Henry joined them and told the story of how his family survived the Great Depression, how neighbors shared flour and eggs so children wouldn't starve, how no one on their street had money, but every home found a way to help someone else. "We got through because we remembered we're stronger together," Henry said. "Seems to me the whole world forgot that somewhere along the way." He wasn't preaching. He was remembering. And, in his words, Lisa recognized a kind of moral wealth Germany had lost long before its cities turned to rubble. Days passed in a steady rhythm of outdoor work. The POWs repaired fences, collected eggs, stacked hay, and tended cattle. It was hard labor, but honest. Fair. No shouting, no humiliation, no guards checking every movement. Henry trusted them to do their tasks without supervision. Lise felt the strangeness of freedom within confinement. One morning, she found herself alone at the far end of the pasture, Rusty trotting beside her as she carried a bucket of feed. A squirrel darted across the fence. Rusty barked once and dashed after it. The sound no longer made her flinch. Instead, she laughed. A soft, surprised laugh that startled her more than the dog's voice. When Rusty returned, tongue lolling, he pressed against her leg as if urging her to continue walking. The touch grounded her, like a reassurance she didn't know she needed. Someone had once told her that dogs could sense the truth in a person's heart. She wondered what Rusty felt in hers. The conversations between her and Henry began slowly. A few words here, a question there, until one afternoon they found themselves painting the side of the barn together. Rusty napped in the shade. The wind smelled of hay and warm earth. Henry dipped his brush in the paint can. "You know," he said casually, "not all Germans are Nazis." Lisa stiffened. No American had ever said such a thing to her. Most Germans she knew had resigned themselves to being viewed as monsters, collectively guilty, collectively condemned. She lowered her brush. "Not all Americans are monsters," she said quietly. Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I reckon most folks aren't monsters, just scared or misled." Misled. The word struck her with unexpected force. Propaganda was a wound she was still afraid to touch. She returned to her work, but her hands shook slightly. For every lie she had been told about America, there must have been lies told to Americans about Germany. And in this place, this simple wooden barn in Texas, they were peeling those lies away one brushstroke at a time. In the evenings back at Camp Hearn, the POWs attended classes set up by the U.S. Army. English lessons, arithmetic, sewing, even music. They received pay coupons for their labor, small but enough to buy soap, pencils, postcards. There were soccer games on weekends, a library, a small whitewashed chapel. It all followed the rules of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the Americans adhered to with almost stubborn loyalty. Education, fare, labor, proper nutrition, requirements Germany had largely ignored in its own treatment of prisoners. In some camps, German POWs even started newspapers and orchestras. The message was clear. America was strong enough to be humane. Cruelty was the refuge of the desperate, and America in 1944 was anything but desperate. The POWs whispered about it in their bunks at night. Some were ashamed. Some were resentful. Others, like Lise, found themselves quietly transformed. If the enemy fed you well, housed you safely, and treated you with dignity, then what did that say about the country you had fought for? But perhaps the most profound shift came not from the food, the work, or the comforts, but from Rusty. He had become her shadow. He followed her through the fields, sat beside her during breaks, and waited at the truck when the workday ended. Other prisoners teased her gently about her bodyguard, but Lisa didn't mind. Rusty was the first creature in America she trusted, and trust, once begun, had a way of spreading. One afternoon, as she scratched Rusty behind the ears, she realized something startling. She'd not thought about propaganda that day. Not once. No visions of snarling beasts or brutal captors. Just the sun, the land, the scent of hay, and the steady warmth of a dog who seemed to believe she belonged here. When she looked up, Henry was watching her with a faint smile. "Funny thing about dogs," he said. "They don't care what flag you fought under. They just know if you're good." She didn't answer. Her throat felt tight. He continued, quieter now. "I hope, when this war is over, people remember that about each other too." Lisa held Rusty close, her fingers sinking into his fur, and wondered how much of the world's hatred came from people forgetting they were human before they were enemies. For the first time since her capture, she felt a strange warmth, a flicker of something dangerously close to hope, and beneath that hope, a deeper fear. If she could trust these people, what else might she have been wrong about? It happened on a cold, sharp morning in late November, when the light came down thin and silver over the Texas fields. The cows had broken through a section of fencing during the night, scattering across the lower pasture. Henry called for help, and the POW women climbed into the truck bed, Rusty leaping up after them with the confidence of a dog who believed every day was an adventure. The work was routine, at least by ranch standards. The women spread out to form a loose line while Henry whistled commands. Rusty darted around them, herding stragglers, barking with energetic authority. Lise watched him with a mixture of admiration and fond exasperation. She never understood how a dog could combine so much enthusiasm with such purpose. Then, in a blur of movement, everything changed. A young steer bolted unexpectedly, kicking up clumps of dirt as it ran. Rusty sprinted after it, too fast, too determined. The cow's hoof struck a jagged stump hidden beneath the grass, sending splinters flying. Rusty yelped, stumbled, and collapsed onto his side. Lisa heard the sound, the sharp, sickening cry, and something inside her snapped loose. She dropped the bucket she had been carrying and ran. She didn't think about the rules. She didn't think about the guards. She didn't think about the boundaries drawn between her world and Henry's. All she knew was that Rusty was on the ground, not moving, and there was blood on the grass. Rusty! The name tore from her throat, raw and panicked. She fell to her knees beside him, hands trembling as she touched his fur. Red smeared across her palms. For a fractured moment, her mind vaulted into every horror story she had been fed. American dogs bleeding, shot dead, punishment for escape attempts, demonstration for new prisoners. Her vision blurred. No, 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 please. Rusty, please. The dog whimpered, trying to lift his head. His tail gave a weak thump against the dirt as if trying to reassure her. The gesture broke her completely. Lisa bent over him, sobbing into his fur, tears carving tracks through the dust on her face. She had not cried when captured. She had not cried crossing the Atlantic. She had not cried eating her first real meal in months. But now, over an injured dog belonging to her enemy, she couldn't stop. Her chest heaved. Her breath came in choked bursts. She clung to Rusty as though he were the only solid thing left in a collapsing world. Henry sprinted across the pasture when he saw them, fear tightening his face. What happened? Did he get shot? Did he... He stopped short. There, in the middle of his pasture, a German prisoner, a woman raised to fear American brutality, was curled around his dog like a grieving mother. Her body shielded Rusty's with a fierce devotion he had never expected from someone wearing POW denim. It was not a performance. It was not duty. It was not fear of punishment. It was love. Henry felt something shift, something he had never been forced to confront so directly, the raw humanity of someone his country had been taught to call an enemy. He crouched beside them, gentler now, voice steady. "He's hurt, but he's alive. Let me take a look." Lisa wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, though tears kept coming. I thought he was bleeding. Someone shot." "No one shot him," Henry said softly. "He just caught a stump. Happens more than you'd think." Her shoulders sagged in relief so visceral he felt it in his own bones. Together they examined Rusty's leg. A deep gash ran along his flank, painful but not fatal. Henry carefully pressed around the wound. Rusty whined and pressed his head into Lisa's lap, seeking comfort. Lisa stroked his ears with shaking hands. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "I thought he was going to die." Henry looked at her. Really looked at her. The fear, the tenderness, the contradiction of her uniform against the softness of the moment. He realized he had never seen this kind of dissonance up close. A prisoner who cried for a dog as if he were her own. He cleared his throat. Let's get him back to the barn. Can you walk with him?" She nodded fiercely. "Yes." Rusty tried to stand. His leg buckled. Without hesitation, Lise wrapped an arm around his torso to support him. The dog leaned into her, trusting her completely, limping step by step toward safety. Henry walked beside them in silence. It struck him then, so sharply he almost stumbled, that there was no universe in which the propaganda on either side could explain this sight. A German woman and an American dog, moving together like two souls who had been waiting for each other. Inside the barn, Henry fetched a basin of warm water, towels, antiseptic. Lise knelt on the hay-strewn floor, Rusty's head resting on her lap. She cleaned the blood from his fur with trembling hands, whispering to him in soft German phrases, fragments of comfort she used to murmur to her younger brother during storms. Rusty's tail thumped lightly in response. Henry watched her work, astonished. "You've done this before?" She nodded. "My father, he raised hunting dogs. When they were hurt, he taught me how to clean them. He said a dog's pain is like a child's pain. They don't understand why it happens." Henry felt something tighten in his chest. Not pity. Recognition. She wasn't a uniform. She wasn't an ideology. She was a human being, shaped by love and loss, just as he was. When the wound was cleaned and wrapped, Rusty finally relaxed, sighing deeply. He nudged his nose into Lisa's stomach, seeking security. She bent over him, pressing her forehead to his. Tears slipped freely down her cheeks. "In Germany," she whispered, voice breaking. "They told us your dogs would kill us. They showed pictures. They made us watch films. They said American dogs were trained to tear prisoners apart." She swallowed, her whole body trembling. They never said they could love. The barn fell silent. Dust drifted through beams of light. Outside, the wind rustled the cottonwood leaves. Rusty's breathing grew steady, deep, trusting. Henry lowered himself onto a bale of hay, elbows resting on his knees. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Not defensive, not angry, but achingly sincere. "Maybe," he said, "they lied about more than dogs." Lisa's eyes lifted to his. Something wordless passed between them, an understanding too fragile for description, too vast to ignore. All the walls built by propaganda, fear, and war suddenly felt paper-thin. She looked down at Rusty again, her hand buried in his fur. "Why would they lie?" she asked. It was not a political question. It was a personal one, raw and aching. Henry exhaled slowly. Sometimes power depends on fear. If people stop being afraid of the enemy, they stop listening to the ones telling them who to hate. She closed her eyes, absorbing the truth that hurt more than any battlefield wound. The Reich had not only lied about American cruelty. It had lied about American strength, American compassion, American humanity. Rusty shifted and placed a paw across her knee. The simplicity of the gesture, the absolute purity of it, broke what little remained of her emotional defenses. She sobbed again, quieter this time, but with a depth that shook her whole frame. Henry didn't touch her, didn't console her. He simply sat nearby, sharing the silence with her, respecting the moment as if it were sacred. And in that quiet barn in Texas, in the presence of a wounded dog and a tired farmer, every falsehood Lise had been raised on finally came undone. Fear collapsed. Truth emerged, and the enemy transformed into something she had never expected. A fellow human being. The letter arrived on a windless afternoon in December, delivered in the quiet, matter-of-fact way bad news sometimes travels. A guard called out names during mail distribution in the women's barracks, and when he reached Brant, His voice softened almost imperceptibly. Lisa stepped forward and accepted the thin envelope, noticing the unfamiliar handwriting and the foreign stamps. Her fingers trembled even before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A German neighbor, writing in strained English, informing her that her brother, Jonas Brandt, had died 6 months earlier at Stalingrad. His body was never recovered. His unit had been surrounded. Supplies gone. Temperatures dropping to hellish lows. He had starved, frozen, or bled to death. No one knew which. No one ever would. Lisa pressed the letter to her chest. The barracks blurred around her. The voices of other women drifted into nothingness. She felt the floor tilt beneath her feet as if the earth were sinking, pulling her with it. Stalingrad had swallowed hundreds of thousands of young men, sons, brothers, husbands. She had known this, yet some part of her had clung to hope, fragile and naive, that Jonas had escaped the jaws of that frozen nightmare. The hope evaporated in a single paragraph. She stumbled outside into the cold air, clutching the letter as though it contained the last remaining piece of him. The world was too bright, too loud, too indifferent. She sat on the wooden steps leading down to the yard, burying her face in her hands. She did not cry loudly. The grief was too deep for sound. Tears seeped silently between her fingers, hot against the winter wind. Rusty found her first. The dog trotted from the direction of the officers' quarters, nose twitching as he picked up her scent. He approached slowly, as if sensing the weight pressing down on her, and rested his head gently on her knee. Lise looked up, vision blurred. "Oh, Rusty. I can't. Her voice cracked. The dog nudged her hand again, then again, with quiet insistence, asking nothing, offering everything. A shadow crossed the yard. Henry Collins approached, hat in hand, face solemn. "You all right, miss?" he asked quietly. She held out the letter with a trembling hand. "My brother, Jonas. He—" Her voice dissolved into sobs. Henry didn't take the letter. He didn't ask to read it. He recognized grief without needing details. He stepped up onto the porch and lowered himself beside her, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that she felt less alone. "I'm sorry," he said simply. 2 words, spoken without pity, without theatrics, just truth. And for the first time since she had heard the news, the world steadied. They sat in silence until her sobs softened. Rusty remained pressed against her leg, unmoving except to breathe. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse. He was only 19. He had never seen the ocean. He wanted to be a teacher. He never hated anyone. "I know," Henry murmured. "Most boys don't." She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "Did your family lose someone?" Henry stared out at the pasture, the winter wind rippling through the dormant grass. "My boy, William, is over in France, infantry." His jaw tightened. "Last letter we got was months ago. Don't know if he's alive. Don't know if he's eating. Don't know if he's warm." Lisa blinked through fresh tears. Somehow she hadn't imagined that Americans feared losing their sons the same way Germans did. Propaganda taught her that American families were frivolous, detached, uncaring. But Henry's eyes held the same ache she had seen in her mother's, the same tightness she had felt every time reports came from the Eastern Front. "I hope," Henry continued quietly, "that if he's captured, if he ever becomes a prisoner, someone treats him fair, gives him food, lets him breathe, lets him remember he's human." Lisa swallowed hard. They should. All men deserve that. Henry turned to her, and the faint winter sunlight made his lined face look both older and kinder than she had ever noticed. "Enemy or not," he said, echoing the words he had spoken weeks earlier. "Pain is pain. A good person doesn't turn away from that." Her breath trembled in her chest. "In Germany, they taught us Americans were cruel, heartless. I believed it. I thought coming here meant torment or death. But now—" She looked down at Rusty, still curled against her. "Now I see you aren't cruel. You're strong because you're kind. You don't need fear to control us. That is the greatest strength." Henry exhaled slowly, humbled by the sincerity in her voice. "Well," he said, scratching Rusty's ears, "we try to do right." The porch creaked as he shifted his weight. "But don't give us too much credit. We're just people. We get scared. We get angry. We make mistakes. But we do have a way of looking after folks when the chips are down. Depression taught us that. Dust Bowl, too." Lisa listened intently. She had heard of those events only in passing. German newspapers dismissed them as failures of capitalism. Yet here was a man who spoke of them not as national shame, but as shared struggle, a time when Americans leaned on each other rather than turning away. She envied that kind of unity. After a long silence, Henry stood. "Come on inside. It's cold out here. Margaret made coffee." Lisa hesitated. Prisoners didn't drink coffee with their captors. It felt forbidden, somehow. But Henry extended a hand, not to pull her up, but to offer her the choice. She accepted. Inside the Collins house, warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. Margaret poured 3 cups and set them on the table. Rusty curled beneath Lisa's chair. For the first time in her life, Lisa sat at an enemy's table and didn't feel like an enemy. She held the coffee between her palms, absorbing its heat. "I wish my parents could see this," she said softly. "I wish they could know Americans are not what we were taught. Maybe then they would not have feared so much." Henry nodded. "Fear's a powerful thing. Makes folks believe anything if it means feeling safe." "But safety built on lies," she whispered, "is not safety at all." He gave her a gentle, approving look. "You're learning fast." Rusty nudged her hand, and she stroked his fur absent-mindedly. The dog's simple affection, constant, unwavering, felt like a bridge between worlds. "Rusty trusts you," Henry said. "Dogs know good people before people do?" She smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I am good." "Maybe not perfect," he replied, "but good enough for a dog, and that's saying something." She let out a breath that might have become a laugh if the grief weren't still fresh. The heaviness in her chest lifted slightly. "Henry," she said after a moment, choosing her words carefully, "I no longer see you as a captor, or even an American. I see you as someone who chooses kindness when he could choose hatred. That is rare in this world." He shook his head modestly. "It ain't rare. Folks just forget it comes easy if you let it." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the pasture stretched endless under the winter sun. "America is strong," she said quietly, "not because of factories or ships, but because of this." She tapped her chest lightly. "Because of your heart. Because you choose compassion even in war." Henry absorbed her words slowly, the weight of them settling into him like warm sand. "Well," he said softly, "I hope we never forget that." She nodded, voice wavering but certain. "I hope Germany learns it someday." He lifted his coffee cup. "To better days." She lifted hers, too. "To truth." Rusty thumped his tail against the floor. And in that small kitchen in Texas, over coffee, grief, and the shared ache of two families praying for news, something irreversible happened. The war did not disappear. The fences did not vanish. Their nations remained enemies. But two hearts, once divided by oceans of fear, now sat across from each other as equals, united by loss, softened by kindness, awakened to a simple truth the world often forgets. Humanity survives where compassion is chosen. The news came in early spring, carried on the same kind of thin envelope that had once broken her heart. This time, however, the words inside brought something closer to relief than sorrow. The war was ending, and the first groups of German prisoners would soon be repatriated. When the announcement reached the POW barracks, a strange quiet filled the room. Some women cried with joy. Others trembled with dread. Going home meant safety, but also uncertainty. Lisa felt both in equal measure. Her heart tugged in two directions, toward the ruins of her homeland and toward the unlikely sanctuary she had found on a Texas ranch. On her final day at the Collins farm, Henry loaded the truck bed with sacks of feed and tools, then hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck as if searching for something to say. Rusty sat beside him, tail thumping nervously against the dirt. "I reckon you'll be heading out soon," Henry said gently. Lise nodded, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Tomorrow." There was a long pause. Henry opened the passenger door and pulled out a small burlap sack, tied neatly at the top. He held it out to her. "Here," he said, "some of Margaret's biscuits for the road, and, well, something else." She loosened the knot and peered inside. Her breath caught. It was Rusty's old leash, worn leather, soft from years of handling, the metal clasp polished by time and use. "I can't take this," she whispered. "Ain't for Rusty," Henry replied with a faint smile. "It's for you, so you remember you had a friend here." The simplest gifts, she realized, were often the heaviest to carry. Rusty stood up then, sensing the shift in the air. He walked to Lisa and pressed his head against her stomach, whining softly. She knelt and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. His whole body trembled with a low, mournful sound, a deep-throated rumble, not a bark, but a protest. When she pulled away, his ears drooped. She stroked his face gently. "Goodbye, mein Freund." As she climbed into the truck to return to Camp Hearn for the last time, Rusty trotted beside it, keeping pace until the engine revved. When the vehicle pulled away, he stopped and let out a long, sorrowful howl that echoed across the field. Lisa pressed a hand to her mouth, tears blurring the world as Texas receded behind her. Decades passed. Germany rebuilt. Children grew into adults who learned of the war only from textbooks and somber monuments. Lise married, raised a family, built a quiet life far from the ruins of her youth. Yet part of her remained tied to a red barn in Texas, to the soft brush of a dog's fur, to the unexpected kindness of a man who should have been her enemy. When she turned 70, her eldest granddaughter asked if there was anywhere she still wished to go. Without hesitation, Lise said, "Texas." The journey back felt surreal. Planes replaced ships, highways replaced dirt roads, the world moving faster than she once believed possible. But when she stood at the entrance of the Collins Ranch, now preserved as a small historical farm and educational site, time folded in on itself. The house was almost unchanged. The porch still creaked. The fields still rolled into the horizon like an endless golden sea. And Rusty, dear Rusty, lived on in the photographs displayed inside a modest museum section curated by local volunteers. Lisa approached one frame slowly, trembling. There she was, years younger, hair wind-blown, eyes soft. with Rusty leaning into her side. Henry had taken the picture, she remembered. He said he wanted her to have proof someday that a war didn't stop folks from being decent. Her granddaughter flipped open the guest book on a nearby table and wrote carefully in English, "America, fed my grandmother when she had nothing. Thank you." Lisa touched the words, tears forming in silent gratitude. When she stepped back outside, the Texas wind greeted her like an old friend. She stood on the porch where she had once sat with Henry, sharing grief and coffee. The world had changed. Countries rose and fell, alliances shifted, new divisions replaced old ones. But kindness, she realized, had a permanence that outlasted politics. A small tour group approached the porch, led by a local historian. He gestured toward the house. This ranch is a reminder that during World War II, even in the midst of conflict, Americans treated over 400,000 POWs with dignity. They followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. Many prisoners later wrote that America's kindness changed their lives. Lisa's heart swelled. She stepped back, unnoticed, content to let the story be told without needing to add her name. Because it wasn't about her. It was about what had been possible. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with deep streaks of orange and gold, Lise found herself whispering words she had carried for decades, words meant for anyone willing to listen. The greatest generation was great, not only because they won the war, but because they kept their humanity when the world was losing it. She looked around, at the fields, the quiet house, the echo of footsteps long gone. In an age of division, maybe we should remember who we once were. The wind rustled the grass in response as if carrying the message across the land. Kindness did not make America weak. It made America worth fighting for. Her granddaughter slipped an arm through hers. "Oma," she said softly, "are you ready to go?" Lisa took one last look at the ranch, the place where fear had broken, where truth had surfaced, where compassion had bridged a chasm wider than any ocean. "Yes," she said with a peaceful smile, "I'm ready." But as they walked toward the car, she glanced back once more, half expecting to see a familiar golden dog bounding across the field. And in her heart, she did.